Well, hello there. I didn't see you come in. Make yourself at home. Have a drink. While I give some attention to some underappreciated characters and storylines that I personally love. And I hope you grow to love as well.
Hey there, everybody, and welcome back. Today we are reading Swamp Thing number 165, and this issue is freaking crazy. I'll just start off by saying that. And actually, I don't think there's any other comics that I can think of that are like this. This is basically an Elseworlds comic in the middle of a run. And if you're unfamiliar with the DC Elseworlds series, basically those are kind of like what ifs. Like, what if the Justice League was bad or whatever, you know? And Marvel does this stuff pretty often. You know, they have the what if series where they have a bunch of scenarios like, what if Conan the Barbarian was in the 70s instead of old world Hyperborea? And then you get an issue that kind of plays that thought experiment out. And basically they're just kind of fun issues where writers get to have a laugh and spread their creative wings. But usually the DC Elseworlds series are in their own kind of confined miniseries and they say Elseworlds on them. But like I said, this is in the middle of this run. It actually has nothing to do with the current story of Swamp Thing getting all the new powers from the different elemental parliaments. This actually goes all the way back to Nancy Collins' run, where there was a side character named Chester, who I believe appeared at first in the Alan Moore run, which started with issue 20, so that's pretty far back. And in that run, he introduced a character named Chester Williams, who was a hippie that kind of liked to do drugs, and he ended up hanging out with Swamp Thing and Abby in the swamp a lot. And through all of the Alan Moore run and the Rick Veitch, Doug Wheeler, and Nancy Collins runs, he was always a friend of them and would show up fairly regularly. But in the Nancy Collins run, he kind of drove away and went to go live his own life in Baton Rouge as a teacher. And that was the last that we saw of him. But what's important for this story is that he was definitely politically left-wing. Like, he was very much into the environment and just all around kind of a live and let live kind of guy. Which right away, you know something's wrong when you see the cover of 165, because in the background, we see a giant Swamp Thing head that looks pretty concerned with what he's seeing. And what he's looking at is a bunch of people protesting, and we see signs that say, liberals re-ruining America, just say no to dope, welfare cheats must die, we love Rush, as in Rush Limbaugh, the right-wing radio commentator from the 90s. And the signs continue with, liberals are ruining America, illegal immigrants go home, and the last one says, Swamp Thing is a hippie. And in front of this crowd, we see a police officer with his hands crossed. He's in full uniform and he's looking very sternly out at us. And above him is a lighted sign with big letters that says, Chester Williams, American Cop. So right off the bat, you know something's wrong because Chester Williams definitely is not a police type of individual. And I'm not sure if this was like an April Fool's issue or something, but it's definitely tongue-in-cheek and it's definitely supposed to be taken like a joke. And also on the cover, we see that this is written by Mark Miller, as usual, with art by Kurt Swan this time, and inks by Kim DeMolder. And in case you don't know who Kurt Swan is, he is a very classic artist who worked mostly on Superman, from what I know, who worked from the late 50s all the way through the early 80s, at least on Superman. And apparently he was even doing work into the 90s because he did this issue. And his art really fits this style. It's very clean and kind of nostalgic, which definitely fits with the conservative storyline of this comic. And as we turn to the first page, we get a letter from Mark Miller himself, and it says, Dear reader, I write sick stuff. I am a sinner. I can't help it. I just unzip my mind and it all comes pouring out onto the page. My stories are full of corrupt cops, perverted priests, and positive references to drugs. And frankly, I think it's time I cleaned up my act. Too many young minds have been warped by sick Vertigo creators, and I want to make some changes around here in DC's obscene adult department. I must say, I'm delighted to see so many Americans embracing Newt Gingrich's Contract with America reforms, and I want to do my bit in this fight against the beliefs which almost destroyed your great nation in the 1960s. This issue of Swamp Thing is in tune with the ideals of the good men waiting to remove the arch-communist Bill Clinton from the White House, and features Chester Williams, the degenerate hippie supporting character from Swamp Thing's more tolerant past, in a light I'm sure many of our more respectable readers will find most pleasing. This is just one clean issue in a sick run of an evil book put together by diseased individuals. I wanted to state the case of the new right in a little more depth, but my wretched, some believe, socialist editor Stuart Moore restricted me to just 23 pages. However, if you want to read more comics adhering to these stricter guidelines in the future, then I urge you to vote accordingly in November. Yours faithfully, Mark Miller. Now all you got to do is change my accent to a Scottish accent, and you will be hearing the conservative version of Mark Miller. Oh, and before we start this, I just want to say there are some accents in this comic that I'm going to do in a very stereotypical or hyperbolic way, because I believe that is the way that the comic is supposed to be read. So I just wanted to warn you so that you're not like taken aback by my shitty accents. So as we turn to the first page, we start off in Chester's place in New York. And Chester's place looks like a fairly small apartment, but it is crowded with people and they are dancing, and most of them are pretty young. They all look like they're in their late teens, early 20s. And we see Chester in the middle of it. He's smoking a doobie. He's got a bottle of alcohol in his hand, and he looks like he's having a blast. And from across the room, two young adults are watching him, a boy and a girl, and the boy says, "Wow, 2 tabs of ecstasy plus half a bottle of whiskey, and Chester can dance all night. He must be the coolest professor on campus." And the young woman replies, "Yeah, my mom and dad saved all their working lives to send me to college, and now I understand why. This has to be the greatest drug frenzy of all time." Then we see amongst the kids, there is a man sitting, and he's older like Chester. He has gray, long hair and a beard, and he definitely looks like one of Chester's hippie friends. And as he sits at the table, smoking a joint and drinking a beer, he's watching a young woman in her underwear dancing. And he says to Chester, "Hey, Chester, feast your bleary eyes on the 18-year-old nymphette from my first-year geology class, man. I promised her all the junk she can snort if she strips off for my friends." And then Chester turns to look at who he's talking about, and he looks kind of disgusted, and he says, "Geez, Wolfie, she's the same age as your daughter." And then Wolfie begins to laugh, and he says, "Yeah, maybe that's why I got the hots so bad." And Chester doesn't really find that funny, and he actually walks up to the woman, and he says, "Pardon me, but you look a little cold dancing around like this. Maybe I could take a look in my drawer and find you a sweater or something, huh?" But the young woman replies, "Are you kidding? All I need is drugs, baby. Junk keeps me warm and happy." And Chester backs off, and as he tries to figure out what his next move is going to be, we see Wolfie say to her, "Keep on dancing, sugar. Slip off those panties for me real slow, and I'll make sure you get a straight A on your next geology paper, plus a lethal bag of heroin thrown in for good measure." And Chester can't believe what he's hearing, and it looks like he's about to do something, but then we see an arm reach out, and a hand taps Chester on the arm, and the person says, "Excuse me, Professor Williams." And as Chester turns to him, we see he's standing next to a young woman, and the young man gives Chester a bro handshake, and then he says, "Listen, you don't know us or anything, but we just wanted to say thanks for teaching us there's more to college than hard work and good grades." And Chester looks kind of confused, and he says, "What do you mean, kids? I don't understand." And then another girl cuts in who's smoking a joint, and she says, "Knowledge is for losers. We're just here to get high and get laid." And at that, Chester gets a very stern face, and he gets very serious, and he says, "Okay, that's it. I've heard just enough of this crud. The party's over." And then he goes over to the radio, and he clicks off the music, and another partygoer yells out, "Hey, what happened to those ambient sounds?" And Chester looks at the boy, and he crosses his arms, and he says, "Your parents sent you to college to improve your minds, not destroy them on drugs. Go home and get a good night's sleep. Some of you have a 9 a.m. lecture in the morning." And then he turns to his professor friend Wolfie, and he says, "That goes for you too, Wolfie. Clear up this mess and get your sorry butt out of my apartment." But Wolfie just holds up a joint to him and says, "Mellow out, Chester. You need to get your lips around one of my special smokes. Just like the touch paper, stand well back, and let this little weed blast your brain into orbit, man." But Chester isn't having any of that, and he actually punches Wolfie right in the face and knocks him over back onto the table. And he turns to the rest of the crowd who are now looking at him, and he says, "I've had it with this hippie bull. Do you know how many kids die every day injecting marijuana? Have you any idea how much pain it causes families? You junkies stay right where you are." And then he walks over to his phone, and he picks up the receiver, and as he dials, he says, "I'm calling the cops." Then we turn the page, and we cut to the street, where all the partygoers are now being led outside to police cars, and we see Chester standing by one of the police officers who arrested all these kids, and the officer's saying to him, "Look at them. There's nothing I like better than seeing this kind of intellectual vermin behind bars. You did a good job here, Professor Williams, a real good job. No doubt about it." And Chester replies, "Just glad to help out, officer. I've seen enough people abuse their bodies with drugs to last me a lifetime. myself included. Maybe this is my chance for a fresh start. And the cop says, well, you're a big fella. You look like you can handle yourself in a brawl, and there's certainly no faulting your attitude towards law and order. Have you ever considered joining the force? And Chester pauses for a second and thinks about it, and he says, of course, I mean, hasn't every boy dreamed about packing a rod and a nightstick? And then he looks kind of disappointed and he says, trouble is, I'm just a stinking hippie. And the officer reaches in his coat and he pulls out a card and he says, don't put yourself down like that, Chester. Get a haircut, trim your mustache, and give me a call at the recruitment office. We're always looking out for fine young men like you. And as Chester looks at the card, he says, maybe you're right, officer. It's about time I got my life sorted out. Then we turn to the title page of this comic, and we see a uniformed Chester who, of course, has short hair now, and his mustache is indeed trimmed, and he's in full police uniform, and he's standing very heroic with his hat in his hand. And next to him, we have the title, which is in American Gladiator from the 90s style font, and it says Chester Williams, American Cop. And of course, the colors on it are red, white, and blue. So it seems Chester did take the officer up on his offer, because as we turn the page, we see Officer Chester Williams walking his regular neighborhood beat, and he stops to talk to an apple vendor who says to him, afternoon, Officer Williams. Beautiful day, huh? Just like one of those golden summers we had when there was a Republican in the White House instead of that draft-dodging socialist. And as they're talking, we do see a very fancy-looking white woman walking with an expensive-looking purse on her arm. But the two men don't take notice, and we see the apple vendor say to Chester, how would you like a nice juicy apple as a small token of appreciation for all the good work you do around here? Free of charge, naturally. And then he tosses Chester an apple, and Chester catches it and he says, thanks for the offer, but the New York Police Department takes a pretty tough line against cops who abuse their status, sir. I'll pay for the apple just like anyone else. And just as he says that, all of a sudden, a thief grabs the purse of the woman who walked by them, and she yells out, help! Police! That freeloader just stole my purse! And the thief yells back at her, thanks for the money, sweetheart. This, added to my welfare check, means another week where I don't have to work like you suckers. And of course, the apple salesman and Chester hear this ruckus, and as they turn to see what's going on, the apple salesman says, son of a gun, did you see that? If only I had my automatic rifle with me, I'd be able to take both his knees out from here, no problem. But while he's talking, we see Chester winding up like he's going to throw the apple, and he says, they say an apple a day keeps the doctor away. Let's see if the old adage applies to this fellow. And he launches the apple at the thief, which hits him in the head and knocks the thief to the ground, and the thief yells out, Judas H. Priest! And as he's staggering around on the ground trying to get up, Chester takes the bag and gives it back to the woman, and he says, it's good to see my old footballing arm hasn't lost any of the magic that took my team to the top of the high school league. And as he hands the purse back to the woman, she says, oh, thank you, officer. You saved me the distress of ringing the bank and canceling all of my major credit cards. And while they're talking, we see the apple salesman walk over to the thief who's still on the ground, and he kicks the thief in the face, and he says, where do you think you're going, shithead? And then Chester comes over and he cuffs the man, and as the thief is pulled up from the ground by Chester, he says, oh, come on, go easy on me, man. I didn't want to hurt nobody. For Christ's sakes, all I wanted was a little dough to put some bread on the table. And Chester, who's not messing around, says, you want to put bread on the table? And then he whips the thief around and he smashes the thief's face into the side of his cruiser. And then he opens the door and he pushes the guy in and he says, do it the old-fashioned way. Go find yourself a job. Then we turn the page and we cut to nighttime and we see the storefront of a grocery store called Midtown Market. And the narration says, Chester's Donut Break. And from the outside, we hear someone yell, okay, everybody, down on the ground and eat some floor. This is an armed robbery, and we're playing by South American rules. Then we cut to the inside of the store, and we see everybody that works in the store and all the customers are down on the ground, and there are 3 armed men, all wearing different colors. One's blue, one's green, and one's red, and they are all Latino men. And we can even see the store manager has his hand pinned to the wall with a knife as he kneels down on the ground in pain. And the one in blue says, hang loose like the Fonzie, and no one gets hurt. But any wise guys think they're super hombres, and we see if bullets really do bounce off your chest, huh? And then the man in green turns to the man in red and says, don't waste time talking, Manuel. Grab anything we can sell. Border Control's gonna tighten up when Bob Dole gets in,
so this might be our last job.
Then we get a close-up of the manager, who, like I said, is down on the ground on his knees, and he is being held to the wall by a knife that has pinned him through his hand. And he yells back to the man in green, saying, "Damn right, Bob Dole's gonna fix you, punks." But then he catches something out of the corner of his eye, and he stops talking, and what he sees is Chester, who's hiding behind a display of cans that is very tall, and Chester is giving him the hand signal to be quiet as he draws his police revolver. But of course, because the manager yelled, it got the attention of the guy in red, who begins to move over to the manager and point a gun in his face, and the guy in green says, "Come on, Manuel, move your sweet A." And as Manuel looks at the manager with an evil look in his eye, he calls back,
"Sure, no problem. Right after I waste this old guy I knifed to the wall."
And upon hearing this, the store manager yells out, "Chester!" And then we hear two shots, blam, blam. And we see Manuel, the guy in red, fall to the floor backwards and presumably dead. And the store manager yells out to Chester, "Nice work, big guy." And in all the confusion, Chester is actually able to run out and grab the guy in green and put the gun to his head. And he says, "Freeze, hairball. You and your good buddy here have a room reserved in the big house." But as he's saying this, the armed robber in blue is grabbing a girl off the floor, and he says,
"I don't think so, hombre."
And then he pulls the girl close and he puts his gun to her head and he says,
"A little bird just told me we were walking straight out the door and taking this girl hostage here as a regular bulletproof vest, huh?"
And the girl pleads with Chester, saying, "Please, just do as he says." And Manuel, the guy in green who's being held by Chester at gunpoint, says,
"You lose, pig. Drop the gun or she dies."
But Chester doesn't waver. He looks directly in the eyes of the guy in blue and he says, "Nobody dies unless I give the order, mister. Now shut up and close your eyes. I'm about to give your friend a demonstration here of what a highly trained police officer in a bad mood can do." And then he pulls the trigger and he blows the guy's brains out. And we get a pretty graphic image of a silhouette of the gun firing on the side of the man's head and the other side exploding. And the guy in blue is stunned by this, and he even lets the girl go as he says, "Madre de Dios." And then Chester points his gun at him and he says, "Your move." And like I said, the guy in blue was so stunned, the girl actually is able to run away, and he actually drops his gun. And he looks at Chester and he holds his arms out and he says,
"Hey, no problemo, officer. The girl goes free and I surrender, okay? I can see you're obviously one tough hombre who means business."
But as he's saying this, he's slowly bringing one hand behind his back. And Chester catches this and he says, "Hands where I can see them, dirtbag." And as the robber in blue pulls out a gun from his back waistband, he tries to disarm Chester by saying,
"Relax, officer. No way I want to mess with Super Cop. I'm cool, baby. I'm cool as a freaking cucumber."
And then he tries to bring the gun up, but it is too late. Chester's too quick for him. And then we cut to a panel on the outside of the storefront where we hear three shots, blam, blam, blam. And we see the last robber smash through the storefront window onto the sidewalk in the front. And there just happens to be a second officer just standing out front drinking coffee, and he yells out, "Great Scott!" as he spills the coffee all over the ground. And then Chester walks out the front door with a paper sack in his hand, and he says to the dead man on the ground, "Not as cool as you are now, hombre." And the cop with the coffee, who's now kneeling down by the dead man, says, "Nice shooting, Chester. I'll give you 10-to-1 odds these Mexican bandits were illegal residents in the United States anyway." And as Chester opens up the paper bag and shows that there are donuts inside, he holds out the paper sack to the other officer and he says, "Then I just saved some customs paperwork. Jelly donut, partner?" And of course, he's got a big smile on his face. Then we turn the page and we cut to some sort of recreational room, and it looks to be full of police officers, and the narration says, "NYPD Social Club." And we see Chester playing pinball in the corner, and standing next to him is a man reading the paper, and he says, "Did you see the paper, Chester? It says here the Louisiana Swamp Thing issued a warning telling us we better take more care of the planet." And another officer standing next to Chester says to him, "Didn't you used to know that, sick freak?" And Chester answers, "Sure, back in my dim and distant hippie past. We were all complaining about the ozone layer and stuff in those days, but at least I knew when to grow up." And the man with the newspaper says,
You turned out good in the end, Chester. I hear they're already talking about making you captain after the way you handled the hostage situation."
Then the men walk over to the bar with Chester, and as they get beers, another man sits with them and says, "Yeah, who would have guessed the girl with a gun at her head would be the president's daughter? Is it true you're invited to lunch at the White House? And Chester answers, I don't care much for the president's stance on homosexuals in the military, but I'm too patriotic to turn down a snack in the Oval Office, guys. And the man replies, You know, you're such a regular fellow. There's one thing I can't understand, Chester. How come there's no Mrs. Chester Williams in your life? And Chester gives a bashful smile and he says, There nearly was, but she left me, buddy. Ditched me for another woman. Would you believe? And the man answers, You gotta be kidding me, Chester. Are you telling me your old sweetheart's a confirmed lesbian? And then Chester gets a longing look on his face and he says, Well, I guess this was before I became a hero cop. Maybe things would be different if Liz saw what a success I've made of myself. And he must have thought about that for a couple hours, because as we turn the page, we see it is the next day in Portland, Oregon, which is where Liz Tremaine, his ex-lover, moved to with her girlfriend. And he is standing in Liz's living room talking to the two women, and he's saying to them as he drinks his beer, Pack your bags, Liz. You're turning your back on this lesbianism while you're still young enough to have kids. And then he burps very loud and continues saying, Come on, let's go, sweetheart. You're about to start a new life as a cop's wife in the Big Apple. And Liz just kind of stands there and takes all this in quietly, and her girlfriend says, Don't listen to him, Liz. He's just a fat drunk. Hit him with some of the feminist literature I've been polluting your mind with since I lured you here. And then she pulls out a stack of pamphlets and begins reading from them and says, Lesbian cohabitation isn't wrong, Chester. I've got plenty of books to back up the theory that there's more to love than just heterosexual relationships. And Chester replies, I used to read books too, but now I see what they do to people, Liz. Too many clever opinions just make you confused, so I burn my textbooks along with all my old hippie clothes and Grateful Dead albums. And then he reaches out and he grabs Liz by the shoulders and he says, I can't dazzle you with big words or fancy speeches, but I know I'm right, Liz. They say actions speak louder than words, so here goes nothing. Can your lesbian lover kiss you like this? And then he sweeps her backwards and he gives her a big old kiss on the lips. And at first she seems to be struggling, but as we turn the page, we see Chester and her kissing at their wedding. And as she throws the bouquet at all the bridesmaids, she says, Chester's maybe the happiest woman in the world. Now let's see who's next to take the big plunge. And as all the bridesmaids scramble to grab the bouquet midair, one of them is saying, She's throwing the bridal bouquet. They say whoever catches it is next for a walk down the aisle. But then we see the woman who catches it is actually Liz's old girlfriend. And with a big smile on her face, she says to Liz, Oh my God, I caught it, Liz. I caught it. Now I get to be a princess for a day too. Then we cut to a couple of attendees at the wedding, and I believe that these are some of the police officers that were talking to Chester in the NYPD rec room. And one guy's got blonde hair and he's taking pictures of Chester and his new wife, and the other's got brown hair and he's reading a newspaper. So the guy that's taking pictures is saying, Former lesbian marries blushing bride to marry New York's hero cop. It's like a fairy tale. Even the dyke she shacked up with wants to get in on the act. But the man with the newspaper isn't paying attention to what the other guy's saying. He's just reading intently and he says, The fairy tale's over, pal. Haven't you heard the latest news about the Louisiana swamp thing? And the blonde hair guy asks, What's that crackpot up to now? And the guy with the paper replies, He says our political leaders have one last chance to clean up the planet or else he's going to do it for us. Then we turn the page and we cut to Chester and his new bride on their honeymoon, and we see Liz has gotten ready and she is naked under the covers, and she says to Chester, who's in the next room, Okay, Chester, I'm ready. God, I've been looking forward to this so much. But Chester walks into the room and he begins putting on his uniform, and she sits up and asks, Chester, what are you doing? And Chester replies, Getting dressed. What does it look like? True love waits, Liz. I believe postmarital sex is every bit as evil as the premarital variety. You wish you'd stayed with your girlfriend now? And then she rushes out of bed and hugs him with her naked body, and as she pulls him close, she says, Of course not, Chester. Sex isn't so important to me anymore. We can just lie here and cuddle for a while if you'd like. But Chester gets very angry at this, and he backhands Liz across the face, and as she falls to the bed, he says, Don't patronize me, Liz. And then he puts on his shirt and his hat, and as he walks out the door, he says, The motel's fitted with cable, so switch on the box if you're looking for a good time. I'm going out with the boys. Then we cut to later that night, where Chester is driving in his police cruiser with 3 other police officers, and one of them is saying, You must be pretty serious about that promotion, Chester. I never heard of any cop requesting the night shift on his wedding day before. Then we cut to inside the police cruiser and we see Chester say, The underworld doesn't call it a public holiday just because some cop marries a beautiful girl partner. There's still a city to protect out here. But he's cut off as his partner points to something on the street and says, "Look, there's one! Bust that crackhead!" And then Chester pulls the car over quickly, and all four of the men get out and they begin running towards a black man in a suit walking on the sidewalk with a briefcase. And as Chester runs towards him with his baton in hand, he yells out, "What have you been up to, scum? Selling junk to 5th grade kids in the ghettos?" And the black man, who is very confused, says, Actually, I was just working late, officer. I've got an important legal case to prepare for tomorrow, and I wanted to make sure my brief was in order." But it seems like Chester wasn't paying attention to what the man was saying because he hits the man in the face with a baton. And as the man falls to the ground, Chester yells out, "They'll be burying you tomorrow, boy." And then all four of the police officers begin to beat the man on the ground with their batons. And I know this is supposed to be satire, but this is a pretty horrific scene because it is very reminiscent of the Rodney King beating from Los Angeles in the early 90s. And just like what happened in that case, it seems that Chester didn't get any punishment for doing that, because as we turn the page, we cut to the White House sometime later, and from the outside we hear someone say, "The president hoped to thank you personally for rescuing his little daughter, but he's busy right now teaching his new secretary to type, Officer Williams. He does, however, send his regards. Truth is, we didn't just invite you here to say thanks for saving the girl, Chester. Clinton's lame duck presidency has a new problem, and we reckon you're the only man who can solve it." And Chester says, "I'm willing to help any way I can, sir." And the man continues saying, "We're worried about the Swamp Thing. He's already issued a threat to the nations of the world to get serious with our environmental policy, but he doesn't understand the effect this will have on jobs." And a very calm Chester leans forward and says, "Some Finks spend their whole lives finding new ways to avoid work, sir." And the man continues saying, "You and he are old friends, Chester. Pay him a visit and see if you can reason with him. Explain to him how much the American economy needs war and famine in other parts of the world to function properly. Tell him it's time he grew up." And then he stands up and Chester stands as well, and they both shake hands, and Chester looks at him with a smile and says, "Leave it to me, sir. Giving the world's biggest hippie a serious lecture on market forces will be a real pleasure." Then we turn the page and we cut to the swamps, where Chester is walking around in full camo, along with a bunch of soldiers, and the man in charge is saying to Chester, "Thanks for taking time out of your lecture tour, informing American teenagers about the threat of anal copulation, Officer Williams. You're a credit to the New York police force." And Chester replies, "It wasn't a difficult choice, General. Swamp Thing is threatening everything we believe in, and the CIA boys reckon I'm the only one he'll listen to." And then the commanding officer says to Chester, "One of the troops I've got posted around the swamp has a poem he wanted to give you before you go in, Chester. He said you two already knew each other." And then a soldier walks up in between them, and he says to Chester, "I don't expect Officer Williams to remember, but he arrested me a while back for stealing a lady's purse. He told me to get a job, and here I am in the United States Marines." And then he holds out a piece of paper, and he says, "I already got to shoot some kids in Waco, murder an old friend of the president in a Washington car park, and now the general here has me monitoring subversive activity in the media. This little poem here I wrote is just my way of saying thanks for sorting out my life, Officer Williams." And then he hands Chester the piece of paper, and Chester opens it, and he reads, 50 godless Russians, 100 Chinese. One U.S. serviceman could beat all of these." And then with a big smile on his face, he says, "Thank you, soldier. Thank you very much." And with that, Chester turns and he begins to walk into the water by himself. And as the commanding officer and the Marine that gave him the poem watch him leave, the commanding officer says, "What a guy. Even en route to his possible demise, Officer Williams takes time out for a few words with ordinary American soldiers." And the Marine says, "If only we had a hero like that in the White House, instead of a blow-dried womanizing pansy." Then we turn the page and we cut to deeper in the swamp, where Chester has been walking for a while because it is now nighttime and he has his flashlight out. And as he looks around, all of a sudden he hears a voice say, "Hello, Chester. I know why you're here." And then he turns and he puts the light on Swamp Thing, and it's very funny because this is actually the reprisal of the 90s grunge Swamp Thing look. So he's got long hair, and if you didn't know, this appeared and ended pretty quickly in the Nancy Collins run at the very end of it. And I think a lot of fans had a lot of issues with it, so that's why they brought him back to his classic look. So it's kind of fun to see him with it now. And as Chester puts the light on him, he says, "Sweet G's." And Swamp Thing says, "They asked you to come here.
to relay their stupid compromises, and perhaps even convince me to change my mind. The presidents and prime ministers of the earth are afraid of my plans to save this world. Fools! They will never understand me in their animal lust for power, and if they thought you, of all people, would seek to convince me, I believe they know you lesser still. I'm going to build a utopia for everyone, my friend. A Garden of Eden stretching to the four corners of the earth. And then he walks over to Chester and he puts his hand on his shoulder and he continues saying, this paradise will be everything you wished for in even your wildest dreams. And then Chester gets very serious and he says, is that a fact? Buddy, these days my dreams are pretty simple. I'm naked, tied to a bed at the mercy of a uniformed Pamela Anderson armed with a nightstick. And Swamp Thing is taken aback and he says, what? And Chester continues, who cares about the destruction of the rainforest or the extermination of endangered animals? Mankind did okay without the dodo, and I'm pretty sure we'll struggle by without the rhino or the tiger. And Swamp Thing, who's still kind of confused, tries to reason with Chester and says, rainforests are the lungs of the world, Chester. You know Earth's ecosystem needs them to help produce the air you breathe. But Chester cuts him off saying, put a sock in it, huh? Typical bleeding heart liberal, trying to spread malicious lies about multinational companies. If chopping down a few trees meant killing life on planet Earth, do you seriously think these educated men would do it? They'd be condemning their friends and families to death. Get real. It's obviously they're already working on enormous machines to suck up carbon dioxide and pump out air. We don't need these things if these guys have technology like that lined up, right? Nature just means hay fever and mosquito bites. We're better off using something we can control. And now Swamp Thing tries to plead and he says, Chester, what are you saying? And Chester fires back, I'm saying big business is the backbone of America. Remove it and everything falls apart. Who pays the nation's wages, huh? Who coughs up all the taxes to pay for the services America depends on? Here's what the world thinks of utopia, pal. And then he gives Swamp Thing the middle finger right in his face and he yells out, shove it up your hippie ass. But Swamp Thing, ever understanding, tries to reason still and says, surely life still means something. And Chester replies, life is just a 70-year opportunity to get rich. Money is more important than life ever was. Why do you think there's tougher laws against bank robbery than murder? If people really wanted to change, they wouldn't vote for those guys on Capitol Hill. People like the world just the way it is. And Swamp Thing says, how can you say this, Chester? All those years you fought for the environment. You believed in me once. And then Swamp Thing looks up at the moon, and Chester follows his gaze, and Chester says, I believed in a million things, and none of them were right. Now I support an ideology with right-wing mass appeal, and nobody's gonna stand in my way. Face it, pea-brain, you haven't got the balls to stand up for what you believe in. Your kind never have. That's why guys like me are in control, and guys like you take all the shit. And then Swamp Thing turns to him angrily and says, your cleverness has forced me to show my hand, Chester. I am indeed the weak hippie you believe me to be. Now where does this leave us? What have you achieved by saving the world from the utopia I threatened to enforce? And now Chester, knowing he has the upper hand, is very proud of himself and he says, power, of course. Is there anything else worth fighting for? I plan to run for president. Then we turn the page and we cut to him doing exactly that. There's a bunch of panels of him at different areas giving different speeches. Some of them are just on podiums on stages, others are on golf courses, and some are in front of chemical plants. And in the first panel it says, Chester Williams on Foreign Affairs. And he's at a podium saying, Mexico? Who cares? It's not the American government's business to worry about a hole like Mexico. And then the next panel says, Chester Williams on Watergate. And at the podium he's saying, our enemies in the liberal media do not simply want to investigate Nixon's involvement. They want to destroy him. If we must now excuse a few crimes, so be it. They owe us. Then we see Chester on a golf course, and it says, Chester Williams on gay bashing. And he's speaking to reporters saying, many common prejudices are rooted in the inherent genetic wisdom of our race. An instinctive recoil from homosexuality is the sure sign of a healthy society. And then as he stands in front of a chemical plant,
it says Chester Williams on the LA riots. And once again, he's saying to news reporters, "Those boys say they had to take back the streets of Los Angeles one block at a time. Fine. Now, my friends, we must take back our own towns and take back our civilization and take back our nation." Then we see Chester on a podium and it says Chester William on feminists. And he's saying, "We ought to kick their ugly fannies back to the kitchen where they belong." Then we get the final panel of this page, and it's President Chester sitting in the Oval Office giving his inaugural speech, and it says, "Chester Williams on you." And he's saying, "I owe all my success, all that I am, to people. Without your support, I would not be sitting here today, and I want to thank you for letting your voices be heard loud and clear." And then we turn to the last page of this comic, where we get a full-page splash of Chester Williams, President of the United States of America, sitting at his presidential desk in the Oval Office, and he looks at us and he says, "Think about it." And with those words, that is the end of the comic. And boy, that was an interesting read. I hope you guys liked it as much as I did. There was definitely a lot of satire and making fun of 90s right-wing talking points, at least as seen by a liberal writer. And like I said, this was just a bit of fun. It's not canon, and it has gone down kind of as its own little Elseworlds issue. So if you guys have any comments, questions, or suggestions, you can email me at planestrains.and-comicbooks, all one word, @gmail.com. And remember, until next time, stay swampy.